Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Empty shelves and long delays for products seem to be a part of everyday life now. Staff shortages due to COVID, shipping bottlenecks and a shortage of components like microchips are all part of a global supply chain nightmare. I wanted to look today at whether the problems can be solved by automation and what it means for those whose jobs are automated. Greg Eyre is the Vice President, Australia-New Zealand of Blue Prism, a UK-listed company that specialises in automation. Greg, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thank you, Sean.
Okay, straight up, does automation have the potential to resolve at least some of the supply chain issues that we're facing at the moment?
The short answer is yes, Sean. The reality is that the big issue with supply chain right now is the fact that there are people who aren't able to make it to work. And as a consequence, there's a shortage of drivers, there's a shortage of delivery people, there's a shortage of people in the actual logistics elements, like in a factory, an assembly plant, warehouses and dispatches. The challenge, I guess, is in other areas where, due to COVID, there's fundamental back office staff that can be repurposed, and we're seeing that already in industry. And how automation can help is by automating the effort of some of those individuals so that they can be repurposed into filling gaps in the supply chain. There are varieties of different ways that it can be used to help that. For example, we've got a fairly simple and small, to some extent, manufacturing plant, and they've used our technology to automate their accounts payable division and their accounting area so that their people can support other areas of the business.
Okay, so when we talk about robotic process automation, we are often talking about that sort of back office paperwork, for want of a better term. At least in the short term, that's where the gains can be made most easily?
Yes, so robotic process automation is a phrase for a new area of software technology. So we aren't talking about physical robots like you would have in an assembly plant, for example. This is a piece of software that takes over the repetitive, mundane type activities that one would typically do in the back office and allows those individuals to focus on more challenging activities, more rewarding activities, and in doing so, support the customer experience, the business better, and therefore really just freeing them up to do better things. And that's something that's really coming to the fore with COVID. People are looking for things that are more challenged to do, not necessarily in the logistics space, but pre-COVID, for example, our technology was able to take aircraft bellies from being, say, 60% capacities on average to 70% capacity. And simply by automating some of the tasks that a human took too long to do, these airlines were able to increase their belly capacity from that 60 to 70% mark through to 80, 90% mark. And again, allowing logistics to flow a lot quicker, a lot better, simply because robots can work a lot faster than humans. And the humans really were challenged with meeting that time frame. As a consequence, you have people in the logistics space quite happy with the outcome of their effort, and they're able to focus more on servicing their customers.
So can you give me an exact example of what you're talking about, be it the aeroplane example or something else?
Yeah, look, there's a number of different areas, but in particular, for example, with COVID, I think the best and one we're most proud of at Blue Prism is when the Australian economy was struggling. It was absolutely struggling. We needed the government and all of the regulatory authorities needed to pump money back into the economy to help businesses survive, re-engineering loans, giving people mortgage holidays, etc. And the banks just couldn't do that in time. They really couldn't. And as a consequence of that, they used our technology, and this is made quite public, as well as other intelligent automation type software, to very quickly and very rapidly automate in a few days, quite literally a few days, the loans processing, the mortgage repurposing for businesses and for individuals. And in doing so, pumping in tens of millions of dollars into the Australian economy so that businesses and people could make it through the COVID period and in support of really our major banks. The reverse is where there are other banks out there who didn't have this capability available to them. And they lost market share because one of the things that happened was the market started shifting very heavily to real estate and people going for a change in lifestyle. And the banks that had this capability available were able to respond to their customers a lot quicker. They didn't get rid of any staff because they still needed them. But at the end of the day, they were able to respond quicker. And those who didn't have this technology, and again, this is published quite widely actually, the ones who didn't have intelligent automation, the ones that did not have robotic process automation like the major banks do, suffered. Their mortgage books suffered. And that's really something we're proud of.
Stay with me, Greg. We'll be back in a minute. Guest this morning is Greg Eyre, Vice President, Australia New Zealand of Blue Prism. So, okay, that great discussion last year, and it sort of still is flowing through with the big banks and the smaller lenders about the time it takes to get a yes or no from a mortgage. That's the sort of thing, one of the big banks, for example, is up to 52 days or something at one point.
Correct.
And that bank lost market share directly as a result.
Yes.
That's the sort of thing we're talking about?
Correct. And now, if you look at the flow of those funds into the economy and then how that then supports the supply chain and the logistics issue, it allows the economy to flow better, much, much better in trying times like this.
The mortgage example is a great one because I see exactly what you're talking about, but they are big organisations. What about ordinary businesses? Whereabouts can automation fit into their businesses and improve outcomes?
I'm really glad you asked that question. And the truth is, it stems with the recognition that times have changed. We live in what I describe as a TikTok world now. People only have 10 to 15 seconds of space. The world's changing. And for you to respond to your customers quicker, digitization through robotic process automation and intelligent automation is one way to do that. So it doesn't necessarily matter how big your organization is. It just starts with one process and one robot. In the case I mentioned earlier, again, this was in response to COVID. You wouldn't think of it. A suit manufacturing company, a very famous one at that, they struggled. They had a factory and they were struggling. And all they needed was one robot because they could see that this was their way out and supporting them through COVID. They've come through COVID now, but they're still using that robot. And the next step is to say, well, look, how else can we do this? It's not going to get rid of people's jobs. I can assure you, a software robot, can't lift pallets in empty containers, which is where we're having a lot of supply chain issues. We need people to do that.
Yep. I think that's the interesting point. For years, people have been worried that automation would lose jobs, but in actual fact, automation creates jobs because it expands the economy.
Exactly. And when this technology was first introduced into the market and became quite prevalent in Australia approximately 6 years ago, that was the business case for doing this. That's no longer the case. The reality is automation just replaces effort. It doesn't replace people. It replaces effort so they can go off and do other things, live better lives, change their current circumstances to something better. And we certainly encourage that.
Okay. So at the moment, the global supply chain issues are probably transitory to some extent. And a lot of the things that you're talking about, the mortgages was an example where you could have a solution for within 2 or 3 days. But mostly for businesses, this is something they should be thinking about over the next year, 2, 3, 5 years,
Correct.
Well and truly beyond COVID. Where do you think we get to eventually with this?
Interesting. It's something that, in my opinion, we move into this domain of artificial intelligence. Again, another scary word for people, and it's nothing to be afraid of. We use artificial intelligence in our daily lives today without even realizing it. Right? If you're using, for example, Google Maps or Waze, you're using an element of artificial intelligence. What I think is going to happen is that as more and more of these capabilities become available to the market and we adopt and actually adapt our lifestyles to that, without realizing it, we'll be using this type of technology more and more, making our lives a lot easier, a lot more convenient, and giving us better and more challenging things to do. Every time you use Google Maps, if you think about it, you're actually using an element of artificial intelligence.
Explain that to me. Why am I doing that?
Quite simply, if you were looking for the directions within a software navigator type tool like Google Maps,
Yep.
and you said, I want to go from A to B, the technology can quickly say, look, here's where all the traffic is the busiest.
Yep.
Here's where all the tolls are,
Yep.
and give you options on which is the quickest and most convenient route to take, as well as what time would be best to leave, if you've got a time frame to get to, and then you pick the option and off you go. And as you're driving, something that really came out a little while ago, but it's still relatively new, it can adapt your route and give you options as to saying, look, there was a traffic jam here, so why don't you take the next left and take an alternative route to get to your destination?
Yeah.
It's very simple, but think about it. We're using this in every day, and we don't realize it.
How do you think this will play out eventually in the mobility of the workforce? So these things that you're talking about, they won't replace people, but people may have to do different jobs. Do you think that creates a more mobile workforce? I mean, we've had the great resignation in the US. I think Josh Frydenberg in Australia called it the Great Reshuffle, and the Reserve Bank basically said, we don't believe it. But what about mobility of workers? Do you think AI actually provides for greater mobility of workers, or how does that play out?
In short, yes. I confess I'm struggling to see, because in my opinion and from my observations, it's more a lifestyle choice as opposed to mobility per se. And so people moving from A to B and finding other means of communicating far more convenient. It allows effort to some degree to be automated by a machine or software. But at this point, I'm struggling to see or envision what that could look like in the future and how it can support how we change. In my opinion, there's still nothing that beats a face-to-face discussion, meeting someone in person, whether it's over coffee, and just socializing with your colleagues. It's very, very different. And as humans, that's something we can't replace with software.
Yeah. Greg, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you for having me.
That was Greg Eyre, Vice President, Australia-New Zealand of Blue Prism. This is a Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join me every morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast with all the business news you need to know. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.